Good morning, everyone, for this special live broadcast, this special recording of an episode with Andrea Muratore, a guest you already know, an analyst who, in addition to Inside Over, collaborates with many well-known faces on YouTube and beyond. Hi, Andrea.
Hi, Janlu. Happy Sunday to everyone.
So, of course, we have a smile right now because it's always a pleasure to see Andrea and it's a pleasure to have him as a guest. But as you know, we have to talk about topics that aren't too happy. Especially, we need to update you on the latest news regarding the war in Iran. Andrea, you wrote an article early this morning about the latest news, which is the death of Khamenei.
Yes, that's right. I waited to write it until the news was confirmed. In the end, the confirmation of these rumors that had been circulating for several hours finally arrived with reasonable certainty during the Italian night. The moment that many had been waiting for a long time, we had talked about it live together in the past. That is the expiration date of the current structure of the Islamic Republic. It arrived in the most traumatic way one could expect. The supreme leader, killed during a meeting, struck after an Israeli-American operation coordinated by the CIA and Mossad, with very intense intelligence gathering, even changing the timing to maximize the damage against the Iranian establishment. A real decapitation strike, the second in just a few months. But it also shows that an era that could have ended has closed in the most traumatic way. Iran besieged, Iran at war, and now it's a big dilemma. What will the Islamic Republic be after the death of the man who represented it? Maybe even more than itself. Khomeini, president from 80 to 89, supreme leader since then, has held positions of power for 46 of the 47 years of this regime's existence. In a certain sense, he was this regime.
Listen, so yesterday already, during the live broadcast we did with other guests, I was saying something. In the early afternoon, more or less, news about the death started to come in. The thing is, in my opinion, obviously also because of the fog of war, there wasn't much information about it. There were statements from the Israel Defense Forces and, of course, from the Iranian authorities who were denying it. Everyone was playing their own game, understandably. It's war, and that's part of the fog of war. And to mix things up a bit, which is something we've gotten used to in these conflicts. One thing I did mention yesterday live, though, is that usually when the Israel Defense Forces, when Israel talks about the death, the decapitation of a leader, within a few hours or at most a few days, the confirmation actually arrives. This, let's say, made me a bit suspicious. Another thing that made me suspicious was the fact that there still weren't any videos. That showed him in some way to deny it, maybe even wounded, maybe with a blanket, so as not to be geolocated, but in some way to reassure the people. Now, we know that in any case, the figure, partly because of time and partly, well, it was to be expected, a possible decapitation of the leadership. So what happens now then, in your opinion?
Well, the scenario for the post-Khamenei era is very complex, so much so that obviously for some time there have been various discussions about what could happen. Given that this figure, who was 87 years old, so his passing could be considered something realistic, were to pass away. So basically, in the short term, we see that there is a key figure, Ali Larijani, who is the secretary of the National Security Council, a body parallel to the government that decides on major strategic and critical issues, and it is a direct extension of the figure of the Rahbar, the supreme leader. So Larijani has been the man who, in these hours, after there was talk of a possible regency by the vice president, set the course. That is, for now, as was expected, after the 12-day war, the figure of Khamenei will not be replaced by another president. The Guardian Council, the Assembly of Experts, and the other bodies must choose who will be the successor in a new election. Something unprecedented, there was only one vote when Khamenei died. For now, there will be a triumvirate of figures who will have to temporarily manage the transition even during a very critical phase. Here, these figures are among the two. The members already identified are President Masoud Pezeshkian and the Chief Judge, the highest figure in the Iranian judiciary, Gholam Hossein Mossenejei. I hope I pronounced it correctly.
I would have noticed Khamenei, Khamenei. I myself have trouble with names, so don't worry, members.
Noticed Khamenei. I myself have trouble with names. Don't worry, exactly. And the third member will be a member of the Guardian Council, a body that, as noted, has 6 theologians appointed by Khamenei himself. Khamenei, I go first. In a certain sense, it's a sort of supreme judiciary with the names, so don't worry, I would have participated in the votes. And those who are excluded, to understand in perspective who will be able to play a role in Iranian politics. So precisely the president, the head of the judiciary, and this figure to manage the war, obviously, and the transition to the post-Khamenei era. Khamenei, I have trouble with names. A new man in power. I noticed Khamenei. I'm talking about the same Larijani. Obviously, first of all, I have trouble with names, which is not a given. There must be a negative answer.
Did you notice? Did you hear this morning? Obviously, I'm also missing the other side. But one thing, quoting our mutual friend, President Amedeo Khamenei, first of all, I have trouble with names, so don't worry. I would have noticed Khamenei gathering right in the squares in Iran. It makes me cry, the death of the leader. We know that anyway, this is, first of all, difficulty with names, so don't worry, the death of a leader. And consequently, also the people who pour out, also because there are religious factors to take into account. I haven't seen any videos yet, though. As for squares where people are celebrating, I don't know if you can give me some insight on this. And I'll also connect it to another question. Don't you think that this attack in some way, paradoxically, actually strengthens the spirit inside Iran?
Yes, I'll go in order. Obviously, it's hard to think that Khamenei still had the same support as before. And the response to the protests a month ago showed a leader who was totally detached from reality. It shows that probably many in Iran will not mourn his death. That said, it's not an immediate transition, also because Iran is a country with a great history. The idea advocated by Trump and Netanyahu is that the elimination of Khamenei should pave the way for a widespread uprising against the regime. They are confusing different levels. Discontent is not necessarily an Israeli or American precursor. From this perspective, it must be understood that there is a system apparatus in Iran that still remains solid. Let's analyze the facts. Yesterday, Iran saw its leadership decapitated, saw its supreme leader killed, saw a fatal blow struck. Otherwise, Pakpur, who was the head of the saw Aziz Nazirzadeh, who was the Minister of Defense, killed, saw a very important figure eliminated, Ali Shamkhani. So, 4 top figures, after all the decapitation that took place in June, still managed to respond, striking Israel and 6 or 7 other countries in the region, hammering the United Arab Emirates, while maintaining a consistent line of control and command. Galibafi, the president, said something very telling. We were ready for any scenario, including the death of Khamenei. So, what could be the Iranian strategy now? To absorb as much damage as possible, and by absorbing the damage, raise the cost of war. For those who continue to besiege the Islamic Republic and don't have the same willingness, potentially, to die for Tehran, in this perspective, the regime can play its second half. And paradoxically, thinking from a political strategic perspective, the death of Khamenei means that it is the war itself, much like the road in sports competitions, that makes the difference. On who is more deserving of succession, let me explain. One of the scenarios we've often discussed, talking about the American-Israeli war against Iran, was that it was very hard to imagine regime change coming through bombs. I think the facts are proving us right. Haven't you seen the collapse of the Iranian system, at least for now? Also because the scenario of a change of course in Tehran will certainly not happen as we often expect, with the protesters taking power. It won't happen with the return of the Shah's son as proconsul. It will happen as a political military transition. It must be understood how traumatic it is within the leadership group that Rijani is the man who has taken command of operations. It tells us how, perhaps to this day, an idea is taking shape that basically sees a power compromise, meaning that Rijani is considered a figure who could be compared to the Iranian Deng Xiaoping. In other words, a transition to a less ideological phase with a strong concentration of power in the security apparatus. So, a combination between a less theological and more technocratic leadership and the power of the repressive and security apparatus. This, of course, in theory and practice, we see that basically the real test will be the ability to absorb the damage from the Israeli-American assault. I'm about to conclude, excuse me. Also consider the fact that a figure who had been relegated to the sidelines, as you think, therefore, political power is now being placed in the leadership trio of the Islamic Republic, something that in the event of Khamenei's death in his bed could hardly have happened.
Look, while you were talking, I wrote down some points that you brought up for me. So, first of all, I was thinking that we did a military analysis, or rather, Andrea Muratore conducted it, regarding Iran's offensive capabilities, which we have somehow learned to understand along with their defensive ones. As for the other apparatuses, or rather the other actors involved, just call Israel. I had the impression, looking at the images, obviously for now it's just an impression. I want to emphasize the response that this time America, the United States, and its allies have received. Because let's remember that Dubai, Qatar, and other Gulf countries were also involved. It was a bit weaker, even though there was a response, compared to the 12-day war where we saw a response with hundreds and thousands of drones and hundreds of missiles. This time, however, I had the feeling that even though there was a response with all the platforms we expected, so drones and missiles, it was slightly less. Now, we don't know if maybe it was due to the fact that the attack carried out by the United States and Israel was a very massive attack. Last night, there were reports of 200 aircraft hitting 500 targets exactly, so that definitely also erodes Iran's launch capabilities. No, but did you also get the feeling that the response was weaker?
Well, it depends on how we look at it. The response against Israel was definitely weaker, directly. That is, even if it was more sporadic, it almost seems like a war of attrition strategy, right? I caused the same psychological damage with fewer resources. Although it's undeniable that Iran has a significantly weakened missile system, in this case, the American intervention was very traditional. The United States, traditionally, when they launch major military campaigns, first target the systems, the ballistic systems, missile launchers, and so on. What used to be anti-aircraft defenses is now also the ballistic systems of enemy countries. However, objectively, the important issue is to understand the political implications. Iran has openly chosen to target all American military systems in the region. In the series, it's politically more powerful to try to hit a ship, which raises the question of whether Iran is capable of doing so or striking. In the region, there are many small scattered bases, because just think about the balance between the damage done and the political result achieved. Even if the entire economy of the United Arab Emirates is blocked for just 1 week, Bahrain would also be blocked. With Qatar, they're going with a lighter hand because Qatar also has a particular role. It shares maritime borders, there's gas. I see that Iran is particularly enjoying targeting Israel's main ally in the region, the United Arab Emirates, which in a certain sense are also paying the price for a very aggressive geopolitical strategy. Sudan is a case in point, without being ready to then face a real retaliation of this kind. So I believe that Iran's balancing act is to raise the cost of confrontation even for its partner countries, to break the hesitation and make them understand what could happen if the war continues. It's a very risky calculation, to be clear, but it seems to me that from this perspective, with fewer resources available, they've gone all in. And this is the deeply complex nature of this crisis, which is already regional. Because if we draw an arc of crisis that touches the countries of the Middle East, considering the fact that even Saudi Arabia has suffered attacks, then we'll see about Saudi Arabia. It's true that MBs pressured Trump for the attack, but there isn't a country within the border between Turkey and Egypt, excluding Oman as a mediator, that hasn't had some kind of military attack within its borders up to Afghanistan, Pakistan in recent weeks and months, because we have Israel, of course, Lebanon, where clashes continue. They've intercepted missiles. Iraq, the attack on the Erbil bases, and also the American-Israeli attack on Kitab al-Bula. To the South, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, not to mention Qatar and United Arab Emirates, Iran, and to the east, Afghanistan, Pakistan. That is, we have a boiling, chaotic arc of crisis and a series of wars that is creating a major war where every country is involved. A small world war in the Middle East or Central Asia, let's call it Central Western, well, it's not a reassuring scenario. The Iranians are in the game within the limits of what's possible.
True, true, true. Yes. By the way, one thing, and here I'm going to wrap up. We need to understand for a moment, and this concerns us Italians, first and foremost. What will happen with Hormuz? Because clearly, if it gets closed, I think Hormuz was actually closed just yesterday. Then I don't know if there was a denial or a reopening, but clearly, given the situation, I imagine it's not possible to sail through Hormuz at this moment. But the thing that was especially picked up by many was the statement from the Houthis, who seem to be resuming their attacks in the Suez Canal and Bab el-Mandeb. So once again, we're going back to that chaotic situation we've come to know. With all the price increases that will directly hit our wallets soon, if the crisis continues.
Absolutely. Hormuz isn't closed. Iran doesn't have the capabilities to keep it closed, but in reality, it's been closed by oil companies and insurers. I was reading Bloomberg just before joining, and they reported that tanker traffic has technically collapsed in that sort of upside down U that covers the Strait of Hormuz. But we should have expected it. We should have seen it coming. I'm quoting our mutual friend, Martina Besana here. In this, it might even be an effect not entirely unintended by Washington, and I'm actually using Martina's own words here. In the attack on Iran, they might be thinking about the anything but China strategy, anything but China, meaning the ones who have the most to lose from the blockade of Hormuz are mainly China and the countries of the East. Cuts, an important jugular of energy supply among cuts to supply prospects. However, at the same time, the American bet is that the cost will be charged to the Iranians. Rosetile solidly deviscato. Not even the other one is related. So, the prospect of seeing a resumption of attacks in the Red Sea is not a pleasant one. And a blockade of Hormuz, because let's also look at something else. Closed by, since Hormuz was closed, was closed by Hormuz, which is closed, but at the same time, the American bet is that the cost, the Iranian bet really is that the cost will be charged. What does it mean? What does it mean? Well, it's not. When the Houthis stopped the attacks, it took a year and a half. Including a new war against the Yemeni rebels before traffic returned to previous levels. Psychology and the market take time to absorb positive news, but they take much less time to absorb negative news. Let's expect a roller coaster. Even from this point of view, I am not sure that American and Israeli decision makers have considered all the perspectives when making their assessments. I particularly noticed the almost total silence before the operation from the American commander, Brad Cooper, who at one point was even in Oman negotiating with the Iranians. It seems to me that those on the ground are fighting this war also out of a sense of camaraderie, but it's difficult to fully understand and convey its perspectives in the media.
From this point of view, let's remember that there are also some interviews with Italian pilots who, in previous wars, said exactly what has just been mentioned. They did their job, but they didn't fully understand, above all, the ethical nature of the conflicts. For example, I look at the Balkans, where there are interviews with pilots who specifically talked about this kind of operation.
The why we fight, if you remember the American manifesto, the American propaganda from World War II, the why we fight, question mark. It always has to be answered clearly, because if not, over time, morale deteriorates. No,
No, you did the right thing. Look, I'll just ask you one question. I'm stepping into a field that's not mine at all, but I have to ask you this question. Some time ago, I heard Professor Aldo Giannulli talking about the advantages that Americans actually have, being major oil producers, when it comes to a possible increase in barrel prices. Now, this thing, in your opinion, can you explain it to me for a moment? Could the closure of Hormuz actually benefit the United States since they are the largest oil producer? Or would it risk causing gasoline prices at the pump to rise? With the midterms coming up anyway.
It's an important calculation. I agree with Aldo when he says that Americans undoubtedly need a high oil price. America has a break even point. For oil, which is extracted with shale gas and hydraulic fracturing, the break even point is between $85 and $90 per barrel. So America needs expensive oil. Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries Plus, Saudi Arabia, Russia, essentially, when they lower the price artificially, they accept lower revenues in exchange for taking market share away from American operators. On a macroeconomic level, everything is correct. The point is all political because, as we said back in Biden's time, Americans are not macroeconomists. They look at the price of gasoline per gallon, not the profits of multinational companies. They look at the cost of eggs, not Nvidia's quarterly reports. That's an important and interesting calculation. Surely Trump has some debts to pay to those who supported him in the construction. The White House, and as a good populist leader, the people matter when they vote, but they matter less when there are these debts to repay.
Well, I thank you, Andrea. Let's remember that we're recording on March 1st and it's 9:50. So if the figure of Khamenei were to re-emerge, which I don't think will happen, but anyway, just know the time when we recorded this. I invite you to follow Andrea's work. You'll find all his references in the first highlighted comment on the Gens Italia YouTube channel. And you'll also find his book where he talks specifically about the next war to come, and he also discusses the Middle East. Andrea, thank you for coming and for your time.
Thank you, Jan. And a warm greeting to all the viewers of Gens Italia.
See you soon here on Gens Italia.